Hey guys, Keelan here with a new Wishlist series. So my intent with this series is not so much to, poke at Infinity Plus 2 and call out all their failings. I think what this is really intended to be is much more of an offering of an alternative world where this game has a lot more interesting choices you could potentially be making, or at least be a lot more up to speed with everything that's been released, both past and present. So obviously with the vast amount of troops we have in the game, the vast number of classes we have in the game, balance is always going to be a problem. It's going to be extremely complicated to try and balance all of those things across each other. However, I do think that balance is one problem, and then just not making good things is another problem. So I think the main thing that we need to focus in on is the fact that this game is fast now. So this notion of empowered troops and the ability to convert gems, this has fundamentally changed how the game is played these days. A lot of these troops were released very recently, and they have now become the cornerstone of pretty much every team that you're going to be using these days. You need to be able to be effective quickly, because if you're not using one of these troops and the enemy team is, it's entirely possible that they steal board control from you the first time they get to act, and you never get it back. I'm sure you've won a bunch of fights on the first turn of your game. I'm sure you've lost a bunch of fights on the first turn of their game. These troops just enable that kind of situation. And while the board RNG is as it is today, where it's not an even disbursement of gems, there's just a chance that it might look mostly green. And if you happen to be a person that's converting away greens to something else, you might just win because the other team can't really stop you from doing this at that point. So with board RNG being the way it is, and these troops existing in the game as it is, with a lot of troops having loot potential in this game, we have to accept that that's the world that we live in today, or we need to change that world. So I'm going to be making this series under the assumption that they're not going to remove these from the game, for instance. I'm going to assume that these will exist, and that's just the way things are today. But with that being said, we need to look at something like even the latest class that was just released. So what I just talked about is that you can potentially win on turn 1, you can win on turn 2, you can win on turn 3, you can win on turn 4. That's not uncommon at all. I would argue that's pretty common if you're making pretty good teams. Winning within 4 to 5 turns, I think, is completely common. That's not at all rare. So let's look at what this is doing. There's a 25% chance whenever you get a turn to do a positive effect to a random troop. So in an average game, I might get to see this twice, and the positive effect could be as pointless as enchant. So this is extremely bad. In today's world where speed is everything, this is way too slow, the chance is way too low, and the status effect is way too weak. So this makes this class kind of bad by default. When you're looking at classes, these traits should be class defining. There's nothing unique about the existing talent trees that exist. So these traits should be screaming Hierophant when you look at this. When I'm looking at this, this is obviously a unique mechanic, but this mechanic is weaker than most other mechanics in the game. It doesn't account for the fact that speed exists in the game now and that you're not going to get many turns. It doesn't account for the fact that there's a ton of troops in that game that can do this way better and way more consistently that you would obviously look at versus something like this. So I think that's problem number 1 when it comes to classes, is that these are generally not that interesting, and they need to be. These need to be the most interesting thing about a class, because this is the only thing that's different across all the classes, aside from whatever cocktail of talent trees they might have. So when it comes to balancing the game, recognize that speed exists, and recognize that this needs to look super cool compared to every other class in the game. These should all feel super unique to this class. If speed's in the game, then this is too weak. That's the biggest complaint when it comes to this class. This could have been a lot cooler if this was 100% chance, or if this was even a 25% chance for all allies, or something else to that effect, something that makes this more powerful, because as it exists now, this is such a weak third trait on a class that just came out less than a week ago. Unfortunately, this doesn't seem to recognize that the game is way faster than this would imply. So when it comes to classes, that's really my biggest thing. I want to have to look through this class list and really fight myself on, is this a knight kind of a lineup that I want to be running? Could I do this with a necromancer? You can't really do that in today's world. You kind of know that there's 3 to 4 classes you might care about, and then there's little pocket picks you might have that are very specific to a specific team. These need to be a lot more interesting. when you compare them against each other. And then when we get to the talent section, this is where I think there needs to be a different kind of a buff. So I'm sure everyone's familiar with the fact that there's a bunch of talents that are essentially wasted talents, things that are just very, very weak, even all the way down into level 100. Again, we get these very, very weak talents. When you've spent all of this time with this class and you get access to level 100 talents, you would want all of these choices to be compelling. As it exists today, this is all too common, where it's just a minor stat bump maybe every turn, or maybe every 4 or 5. If you're lucky, that's considered like amazing compared to these. But when you're looking at this level 100, fortunately this class at least gets access to probably one of the best talents in the game. But there's no option when I get to level 100. It's this one. If you're running this class and you're not running this one, you're not doing it correctly. There's no reason why you would ever pick this one or ever pick this one. And when you're at this level, at least this makes some sense because you have a choice to make here. But once you get up to this level, there's no choice to make. This is not an option. This is not an option. This is an option because this scales. This implies that you could be taking advantage of this constantly. This is something you just get once. This is something that you just get once. So again, it's kind of like everyone's got these cookie cutter builds. So my proposal on what a change to this would need to be would be these level 1 talents can all suck. That's totally fine. I would expect something to get at level 1 to not be good. But once I get to level 5, that should suck a little less. Once I get to level 10, that should suck a little less. This should start to look pretty good. This should start to look really cool. This should start to look awesome, and this should be amazing across all of them. So that way when I'm leveling up this class, I really have to fight myself on which one do I want and what makes the most sense for the team that I'm making. That's really going to open up talent trees for all of the different classes. And again, I recognize that that introduces a major balancing problem for Infinity Plus 2. They have not balanced these trees to reflect that all of these talents, these cocktails of which talent trees exist in each class, if they balance them out that way, they probably will have to pay very close attention to how they change these. But I think that change is completely worth it. And again, I would argue that I would much rather them make the game busted, like make these all different, and then let us just find out how crazy or broken that actually is. I would argue it's not going to be any worse than the world we live in today, where there's only like a handful of defense teams that you genuinely are afraid of, a handful of classes that you actually want to play with, a handful of troops that you need to put in every single lineup because otherwise they're not going to be competitive. Introducing variety is going to make this gigantic troop pool, this gigantic class pool, that much more interesting. So make these more interesting at every single level, make me have to figure out what I want in each of these. You could even introduce a mechanic where, since every class has cool traits or talents they could be taking at each level, within the game you could see like they've picked these talents on their character picture. As it exists today, you can't really tell what they're running unless you actually like dig into a couple menus in a fight. If you're changing to a world where these can be dramatically different for each like fight that you play, you're going to have to make this a little easier to identify so that way we're not just constantly getting caught off guard. So I fully recognize that there's a good amount of change you would have to do. It's not as simple as just making these all better and then putting it in the game. You would have to implement other quality of life improvements to account for this. But I think that's kind of the end goal. And again, since this is a wish list video, this is kind of the change that I'm hoping could be introduced into the game. Recognize that speed exists and recognize why this is not a compelling trait to take. Recognize that when it comes to talent trees that we should be having hard choices to make or interesting choices to make at every single level. So that way every single class isn't cookie cutter once it's done. Every Hierophant doesn't look exactly the same. The Hierophant class might actually be worth running because you've made this a lot more interesting. Once we get to that point, every single class gets opened up and every single person has a reason to level all of these classes. As it stands today, you could level up maybe 3, at most 4 classes, and you can do 100% of everything in the game and run pretty much every single team you could possibly want to make. That's not really the world that I think that we all want to live in. And I bet that Infinity Plus 2 agrees that they want to come up with reasons for us to play other classes. I think this is the way that it gets done. This kind of brings me to the next part, which is going to be troops. For this first video, I'm just going to be covering like my high-level view on classes, and then for this one, I'm going to focus in on Mythics specifically. When it comes to Mythics, I'm sure you've probably had this feeling of elation and sadness when it comes to which Mythics you get. So there's some Mythics that we all recognize are pretty bad, and then there's other Mythics that we all recognize are really good. and I think that's a problem. Obviously, someone like Zul'Goth that is really hard to get, an extremely valuable troop, this makes sense. His ability should be amazing. Someone like Zathanos, that is pretty complicated to make since it requires other things beyond just the traditional mats. Someone like him should be used a lot, or should be at least compelling to use. As he stands today, he doesn't have loot potential, his ability is very weak. The ability to summon troops is also very weak from an attack perspective. His traits are not even that interesting. When it comes to someone like Zathanos compared to Zul'Goth I think is the game scaled right. I would love to see troops that are this valuable. Like if they're this hard to get, they should be this valuable. This guy being pretty hard to make and being this weak is a sign that this should be stronger. Like people should want to be crafting this guy. They should be working towards crafting this guy because he is so cool. As it stands today, whenever I see someone craft Zathanos, I hope to God that that was the only other mythic they needed besides Zul'Goth, because he's essentially not used in any capacity. So that's kind of a problem. When you're looking at the mythics that exist in the game, the power difference between two of them can be so vast. When we're looking at Fallen Valdis, you would probably never run her ever. You cannot build a team that you can consistently use that's going to have her in it that's really going to be interesting or effective. It's just not going to happen. So when it comes to that troop, and you compare it to a troop like Infernus, or even the more recently released Obsidius, these troops are in line with the way the game works today. Obsidius is someone that's doing really solid damage. He's getting you a lot of mana. He's potentially doing a really cool effect to all the enemies on a 4-5 match. He has some really nice benefits. When you get Obsidius, you're really happy. When you get Fallen Valdis, you're extremely unhappy. I remember not being excited at all. I was disappointed that it was this troop. And I'm not going to sit here and argue that the power levels between all of these troops should be completely identical. I understand that even in every single major card game that exists, there's power differences between equal rarity type cards. Not every single card is going to be Infernus, not every single card is going to be Obsidius. I understand that. But they should have value somewhere. Using Gargantuar as an example, this damage is laughably poor for a single shot, and the fact that its boost ratio requires people to die or be killed makes it even worse, and the scaling is low. So if you've already lost 2 troops, you won't care that this guy's doing 70-ish damage in one shot, because A, 70-ish damage isn't even that much, but B, you've already lost 2 troops, he has no loot potential, so you just gave away your turn to maybe hurt somebody, and that's the end of your turn. Then they're going to loop on you again, and then you're dead. So someone like Gargantuar, the concept behind him is just not up to speed with where the game is today, which brings us back to that original thesis of speed. Gargantuar does not account for the fact that the game is over super fast. All orcs in the game are not really built around the idea that the game is over super fast. He's built around this idea that you're going to hurt yourself with Garnock, you're going to summon a bunch of random orcs, they're all going to die, and then all of a sudden he's sitting there doing 100 plus damage because he's been gaining all this attack and magic as the games have been going on. The way that it actually plays out is that Gargantuar just dies and then the game's over. You're not going to have time to summon all of these troops and keep this guy alive. He's just going to die. So he's not really up to speed. So that's what I would say needs to really change when it comes to Mythics. I would say that there's some obvious Mythics that are just really, really bad that you would never put in the game, that you would never use in the game, I should say. And then there's Mythics that obviously have some utility, some value. Someone like Doomclaw is kind of in that sweet spot where there's a chance he does something really cool. So you can build lineups with Doomclaw. I've even built lineups with Doomclaw. If I was in an event and I didn't have High King Iron Gut yet, there's some value to this guy. You would potentially be using him in some capacity. He's also doing some other utility stuff. His damage that he can do is pretty chunky. It's not dramatic, but it's pretty cool. So he's at least interesting. I would put him in a lineup as a Hail Mary kind of troop. I could potentially see myself using him. Whereas there's essentially no value to using him because doing damage to all enemies is not a unique thing to do. Exploding even gems as you're doing it is not a unique thing to do. They just released a Queen Xochi troop which does damage to all and explodes gems. The only thing that troop's not doing that this one does is this one's boosted by Divine Allies by a really crap amount, and then silencing Divine enemies. So if you're fighting a Divine team, this troop is pretty good, but if you're not fighting a Divine team, this troop is kind of garbage, and that's super specific. So I would argue that they should look at all these mythics and dare to really, really boost them. Make Abyssina do something cool. Make her not just explode gems and maybe summon a dude. Make her do damage. Make her, like, curse everybody. Make her, like, curse people on 4/5s. Like, make her interesting in some capacity. Make me want to have a reason to put her in a lineup. As it exists today, someone like Ragnarod is potentially better. Someone like Harpy Mage is potentially better. There's troops that will just explode the board early, like way faster than her, requiring 22 mana to just blow up the board and maybe summon a dude who's mediocre as he is. This troop is laughably bad and is outscaled by a ton of legendaries in the game, let alone other mythics. So dare to make these troops really strong, a lot stronger than they are today, and let us find out, how bad would it really be? At worst, I think you're going to introduce some troops that we would actually suddenly care about again. The lineups that we could potentially build would be a lot more interesting. Someone like Draculus, for instance, like the idea of him is interesting. You're going to have this super beefy frontline tank guy who's going to be so hard to kill up in that top slot. His base attack is pretty high, his base stats are pretty solid, and he's going to constantly be building himself up. This is a really cool idea, but since he has no loop potential, he's more than likely just going to die. You're going to use his ability, and now you're going to be spending a bunch of time trying to get a mana again. Constantly looping with this guy as your, like, stopping point for your turn is not an exciting prospect to do. No one uses Draculus when in lineup. When I first got him, I tried my ass off to try and get him in lineup. And of course, in the earlier levels, this was kind of working. And then as you go later and later into the game, you realize that you'll never use this guy again, and he's laughably poor. Like, when I see people putting Draculus in lineups, I'm trying to figure out why would you pick him versus somebody else? He's not doing anything all that interesting. In theory he is, but in reality he's not, because again, speed is in the game now. Somebody like him with no loop potential whatsoever, someone that's just firing off something once, and then you're giving up your turn to the other team, it's not a compelling troop to use. If speed is a component of the game and looping for every single cool troop is a thing that's in the game now, we need to acknowledge that that exists. We need to acknowledge that if someone doesn't loop, their ability should be so cool. Like, to me, that's where Megavore is perfectly balanced in even today's world. His ability is so strong, his traits are so cool, that having him in your lineup, even though he doesn't loop, is completely possible. Like, it's still a valuable troop regardless. Megavore is like the level that all non-looping mythics should aspire to be. Interesting across the board for the spell, interesting for the traits, and just a cool troop. It's worth firing his ability because it's so devastating, versus somebody like Gargantuar, where you fire off his ability and it is not at all devastating. It is a whimper in comparison to most other things in the game. So I think that's what I would say really needs to change, at least at the mythic level. Make these a little more compelling, or make them a lot more compelling. Make me have a reason to want to have one of these in my lineup. They all should have some niche way of being used. As it stands today, they're either so bad that you would never use them, or so specific that you would only use them against like a team or two, versus someone like Worldbreaker where you could just put them in a bunch of lineups, or Tina where you could put them in a bunch of lineups. A lot of these mythics are just so specific that they're not going to be used in any kind of regular capacity. And I think that's a real shame. So that would be my wish list from a mythic perspective. More interesting classes, more interesting. Recognize that speed exists in the game and balance accordingly from there. That is a really high ask of the developers. I recognize that that could not just be done by changing some variables on the back end and everything just works. But I really do think that those are some of the changes that need to happen to introduce a lot more complexity, a lot more variety, a lot more dynamics into the game that will just make players that already love the game just love it that much more. So this is an intro video for my wishlist series. I plan on going into other things like game mechanics, as well as like the shop purchasing options that are available, even some quality of life enhancements. This wishlist series is not necessarily meant to be taken extremely seriously. Yes, I would love to see all the things I'm talking about being discussed, but I also work in the industry where I understand that things are not as easy to implement as they are to talk about. But again, I do want to shoot for the moon as a enthusiast of the game and see if any of these things can stick, or if there's some community consensus on stuff that would need change. I do want to just end this on a note to say that, again, I am extremely grateful for the developers of this game for the great game that they've made. These are my endgame player complaints, if you will, or quality of life improvements, or interesting dynamics I'd like to introduce. This is not at all me saying this is a bad game that's totally busted and unplayable. This is me just hoping that the world could be a little bit brighter, a little bit more interesting. So I hope you enjoyed this video. There'll be others of these to come in the Wishlist series. But I will talk to you guys in a future video, or potentially on stream. Talk to you guys later. Bye.